Let's play this clip, Nancy Pelosi. I want to be, no, I don't really necessarily want to be generous, but I mean, I just want to be fair insofar as that I could see an argument why one wouldn't impeach. I can see various ones, but I can see the validity of an argument that says, like, oh, this is going to hurt the reelection chances of members of my caucus in purple states, and that's why I'm not going to do it. That argument, though, needs to be backed up, particularly if you're the Speaker of the House, with an actual plan to do something in between now and the election. Because if you leave a vacuum for someone like Donald Trump, he will fill it. If you leave a vacuum for someone like Bill Barr, he will fill it. And they will fill it with their own investigations, and they will fill it with their own Republicans who go out who are completely shameless in pursuing these things. And the only plan that I could see there, I don't know what it would be. Maybe another sort of like a type of investigations, or my understanding is they've passed all the bills that they had really basically set up. They've passed a bunch of them. It hasn't particularly worked. I mean, there's a bunch of votes that they've taken, but those votes aren't going to go away. If you need votes to run on, they have them. The idea that you would be in any way contemplating at this moment what Nancy Pelosi is expressing at the Pete Peterson Foundation. Pete Peterson was Nixon's Commerce Secretary, billionaire from, I think it was BlackRock Investments or something like that. He recently died. Nancy Pelosi was very praiseful upon his death. They are basically looking to raid Social Security and Medicare long term. And they do it through deficit hawkery. And they have purchased, there are so many of these summits and so many Pete Peterson Foundation grants and whatnot that it's very hard to find journalists, particularly over a certain age, who have not been in some way funded in some endeavor or another by Pete Peterson. Then they all haven't been corrupted by it necessarily, but it certainly dominated the discourse. This is stunning. She's at a fiscal summit 2019, Building America's Future, being interviewed by Madhu Raju.
Before we get into the issues of the conference, I do want to talk about some of the issues that have been in the news over the past week. You were traveling abroad, and you were in Normandy. The president was in Normandy, too, and he made some comments about you. He was sitting in the American cemetery in Normandy, and probably the most aggressive remarks I've heard from a president make about a Speaker of the House. He said that you were nervous. He called you a disaster. He also called you a nasty, vindictive, horrible person. This is not me. This is the president saying this. He later went on to tweet that you were a disgrace to yourself and your family. So, I mean, how do you react to the President of the United States calling you, the Speaker of the House, insulting you like that?
Well, what bothers me more is that we're talking about that instead of how to reduce the national debt. Let's just say this. We were...
Now, look, I can understand the idea to make it look like you're talking about business. And if you don't want to talk about him, say, well, he's a bit of a child. Let's move on to something else. But does she understand that in success, what she's setting up with this, there are a million other things, a million other places she could have been yesterday, or today rather, to do that same pivot. He's a child. I don't want to talk about him. I want to talk about infrastructure. He's a child. I don't want to talk about him. I want to talk about monopolies in our healthcare industry. I want to talk about monopolies in our tech industry. I want to talk about healthcare for Americans. I want to talk about what's happening in terms of a woman's right to choose. I want to talk about the judiciary. I want to talk about getting wage growth up after a month where wage growth was stagnant and jobs fell. I want to talk about dealing with wealth inequality. I want to talk about dealing with women's health issues. I want to talk about the opioid crisis. There are a million things that she could have brought up in that instance. I want to talk about what's going on with the destabilization in the Middle East. I want to talk about what's happening with the Dreamers. I want to talk about what's happening where we're trying to leverage our trade to force Mexico to have draconian policies towards people who are escaping violence. A million things she could have talked about. And she's choosing to talk about the one thing that in the event her strategy works and gets more Democrats elected, that they will be faced with having to impose austerity policies because she has already laid the premise that the real problem we have is a debt crisis. It is beyond unconscionable. It's unconscionable from a policy standpoint because we have no more of a debt. We don't have a debt crisis. And it's unconscionable from a political standpoint because everybody who pays an ounce of attention to this has seen what the Republicans do. They have done this since the Reagan era. They drive up the deficits and the debt. When Democrats get into office, they force Democrats to cut and to build towards a surplus. And then when the Democrats are out of power, they drive up the deficit and the debt. Rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat, rinse, repeat. Specifically, how many times we went from Republican to Democrat to Republican to Democrat to Republican to Democrat and did those same things. And we now know that all of the supposed literature and academic research that suggested that we were in a debt crisis was BS, like literally a spreadsheet that hadn't been double checked. Reinhart and Rogoff.
Identified by a grad student at UMass, just to underline how radical a mistake that was.
Yes, and everybody had adopted it. And you know, Pete Peterson had enshrined these guys. I don't even know if they can walk.
What was the book called? I used to remember.
I don't
remember either.
So there you have it.
I just would like to add briefly. I mean, I think that though that this is where, and I was reading Bhaskara's book in preparation. He does a good job of explaining like the elements of understanding the third way globally, going back to the 80s and 90s, and how, you know, it does fit in with what even that Nancy Pelosi sound. And in some ways, there's like the personal failings of politicians, there's the fact that they're all compromised by corporate campaign contributions, and then there is the balancing act between basically having a political conflict between one party that's there to purely indulge capital interests. They have absolutely nothing else to do, which are the Republicans, obviously. And then a Democratic Party that sort of like has to triangulate between preserving remnants and then helping facilitate the next rounds of basically austerity. And, you know, there was definitely in the 80s and 90s structural reasons for that. And so it's like a question of escaping that ideologically and in terms of your donor base, but also hopefully reconfiguring how people understand the economy as well.
Let's take